Hi, fifth graders. Today's video is all about the distributive property. And the distributive property is a property that helps us to break apart large numbers so that we can solve problems using mental math. And I'll tell you, this is definitely one that you'll actually use in real life because I find myself using the distributive property a lot, especially when I'm shopping or planning for a project. If I don't have my phone with me for my calculator or I don't have a piece of paper and pen to actually do the work, I like to use this strategy because it helps me figure out what my product or my quotient is going to be using mental math. So let's take a look at how this works. For multiplication, when we use distributive property, what we're doing is we're sharing a factor between a multi-digit number in order to help us solve using mental math. So for example, I might have the problem 9 times 37. Now, I don't know 9 times 37 off the top of my head, and I don't expect you to either, but I can use some mental math strategies to help me solve this question. So first, I know that the 9 is going to stay the same no matter what I do. So if I'm trying to show this using a picture, I might draw a chart that has 9 different rows on it. And now I need to figure out how can I break apart that number 37 in order to solve the problem mentally. What the distributive property tells us is that we can split apart this number 37 into pieces that are easier for us to do using basic facts. So one way we can do that is by splitting it apart by place value position. In other words, I could take and multiply 9 times 30, because the 3 is in the tens place, and then 9 times 7, because the 7 is in the ones place. So that would look a little something like this. First, I would have 30 groups on the left. That means I'm going to have to first figure out how many tiny little rectangles are in this portion of my grid. Then on the right, I'll have a group of 9 times 7. That will tell me how many little rectangles are in this portion of my grid. Once I solve those two parts, I can combine them to figure out my final answer. So first, 9 times 30 is going to be the big chunk on the left, and then 9 times 7 is going to be the smaller chunk on the right. I know that 9 times 30 is 270 because I can see the basic fact 9 times 3 hidden right inside it. And since I'm multiplying instead by 30, I know I'm just bigger by a power of 10, or 270. Then 9 times 7 is a basic fact, so I know my section represented by the blue rectangle is worth 63 little boxes. So now I can combine those two pieces together to get my final answer, which means 270 plus 63 tells me that there were 333 mini rectangles in my grid. So if you're looking at this and thinking that the distributive property looks an awful lot like the array method, you're right. So if you really liked using the array method or the area model last year for multiplication, you are already on the right track for the distributive property. Now let's take a look at some tiny little differences when we're using the distributive property to divide. When we're dividing, we're still using mental math strategies and breaking apart large numbers. Let's look at the example 70 divided by 5. Now this time, I'm going to know that there are already 70 little pieces inside my grid. What I'm trying to find this time is how many columns those 70 pieces are broken up into. So right now I'm going to draw a grid with 70 little pieces. I know that I'm still going to have 5 rows along the side, so I can put that 5 in right there. Now what I have to figure out is how do I break apart these 70 pieces to show me smaller sections so I can find my quotient. And the 5 is going to be really helpful for this. I always recommend by starting with multiplying your divisor by 10 and then asking yourself, is that bigger or smaller than my dividend? Well, what do I mean by that? Well, 5 times 10 is 50. And since 50 is smaller than 70, I know that I can use 50 of these pieces and get rid of them right away as the first part of my answer. So then I have to figure out, well, what would be left? In order to do that, I do 70 minus 50, which leaves me with 20. So on my picture, that means that I know I have a section full of 50 pieces on the right, and on the left, and another section of 20 pieces on the right. Well, now I have to figure out how many columns were they split into. I know that I can do 50 divided by 5 to tell me how many columns this pink section was made up of, which would be 10. And then I can do 20 divided by 5 to tell me how many columns the purple section was made up of, which would be 4. To find my final quotient, I would just add together these top two pieces of 10 and 4 to tell me that 70 divided by 5 is 14. Let's look at one more division example before we move on. I'm going to look this time at 112 divided by 7. So again, I know I have a grid with 112 pieces, and I know that they are split up into 7 different rows. What I need to figure out is how many columns go across the top. The 7 is going to help me do that by seeing if I can take a multiple of 10 out of the 112 to start off my work. 7 times 10 is 70, which is smaller than 112. So now I need to think, well, how many pieces would be left over in my second section? 112 minus 70 is 42. So that tells me my second section is going to be 42 small pieces. So I'll have a group of 70 and a group of 42. Now the pieces of my problem are 70 divided by 7, which is 10, and 42 divided by 7, which is 6. So to get my final quotient, I just add those two pieces together, and 10 plus 6 is 16. That helps me know that 112 divided by 7 is 16. I hope this was a helpful way for you to learn some mental math strategies with the distributive property. Thanks for tuning in and watching.